Imagine your country's population well, imagine it grew by 500%
Right.
in just a single lifetime.
Which is, I mean, it's almost impossible to picture.
It really is.
Yeah.
Because in most modern economic models, that kind of explosive growth is supposed to signal this golden age.
Yeah, you'd think so. Strength in numbers.
Right, exactly. You picture this incredible boom in industry or a massive expansion of the tax base.
Hyper-innovative cities, a huge consumer market.
Right, all of that. But today we're taking a deep dive into this really fascinating 15-page data report. And it covers a specific group of nations where almost 1 billion people just materialized over the last 60 years.
Yeah.
And the crazy thing is the wealth just did not follow.
It didn't. And it's honestly one of the most significant structural paradoxes in modern economics.
It really is.
So we're looking at a comprehensive stack of data covering what economists call pre-demographic dividend countries.
Well, PRE countries,
Right.
For short.
Exactly, PRE countries. And this data tracks them from 1960 all the way into the 2020s. It's pulling from demographics, educational funnels, health burdens, and even environmental indicators.
So it's incredibly thorough. And I guess the central question we're unpacking for you today is, how does a billion-person demographic boom become like an economic black hole?
Right, because the numbers are just staggering.
Yeah. In 1960, these PRE countries had roughly 188 million people.
Mm-hmm.
But by the 2020s, that number didn't just grow, it exploded past 946 million.
Which is a completely different scale of human existence.
Yeah. But they are entirely locked out of the prosperity that typically follows that kind of boom, the prosperity we call the demographic dividend.
So to really frame this data, we have to look at the baseline characteristics of a PRE country.
Okay, let's unpack this. What exactly defines them?
Well, these are largely low-income nations, right?
Yeah.
But their defining macroeconomic feature isn't just a low GDP. It's the actual structure of their population. Specifically, they have a national average fertility rate that remains above 4 births per woman.
Which means they are stuck at the very, very beginning of a demographic transition.
Exactly.
And looking at the charts here from the report, the transition isn't just slow, it almost appears completely stalled.
Yeah, and what's fascinating here is that the mechanism of a demographic transition is usually really sequential.
Okay, how so?
Well, historically, when a nation starts to develop, the mortality rate is the first thing to fall.
People just stop dying as often.
Right. Basic public health interventions, sanitation, early medicine. It means people stop dying at high rates, especially infants.
Got it.
Then, maybe a generation or two later, the birth rate falls to match that new survival rate.
Because families realize, oh, we don't need to have 6 kids to ensure 3 survive.
Exactly. But the data from these PRE countries shows this really critical disconnect. The mortality rates are plummeting, but the birth rates are just stubbornly high.
Yeah, I'm looking at the curve from the report right now, and right around the year 2000, the population growth line it suddenly pitches upward.
Yeah, the slope changes dramatically.
It's almost vertical. Why 2000?
Because that is when massive global health initiatives really began scaling up in these regions.
Oh, wow. Okay. And that brings us to this concept of the crushing weight, right? The youth dependency ratio.
Yeah.
Because we can't just look at that raw 500% growth.
No, we have to look at exactly who makes up that 946 million people.
Right, because it's not, 1 billion factory workers and software engineers suddenly entering the chat.
Far from it. So the youth dependency ratio measures the number of children under 15 compared to the working age population.
Okay.
In these PRE countries, that ratio has been hovering between 80% and 90% for decades.
Wait, really? 80 to 90%?
Yep. And meanwhile, the old age dependency ratio, so citizens over 65, is sitting at roughly 5.7%.
That is, I want to build a model for that, because an 80 to 90% dependency ratio is really hard to visualize on a national scale.
It is.
It's like, imagine trying to run an economic marathon, but every single runner in the working age category has to carry 3 teenagers in a backpack.
That's a great way to picture it.
You can't sprint. You can barely even maintain a steady walk. All of your energy just goes into simply keeping the weight you're carrying supported.
Yeah, and that analogy perfectly illustrates the core economic failure of this stage.
How does that play out financially?
Well, think about a balanced demographic structure.
Right.
A worker creates value, uses a portion of it for their own living expenses, supports maybe one or two dependents, and then crucially, they deposit the surplus into savings.
Right, the leftover money.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And national savings form the liquidity pool that banks use to issue loans to businesses.
Oh, I see.
And those businesses take those loans, build factories, buy equipment, and expand the economy.
But with a 90% youth dependency ratio, there is no surplus. The relatively small working-age population is pouring almost all the value they create into pure consumption, like food, clothing, basic shelter for all these non-productive youths.
Right. The wealth is consumed the very moment it's generated.
Leaving the liquidity pool completely dry.
Yeah.
So there is zero domestic capital available for business reinvestment.
Which is why understanding the gap between fertility and survival in these countries is so vital. It's not just some abstract statistical lag. It is the engine of the trap itself.
Right.
Just look at the timeline. From 1960 to 2022, life expectancy in these regions made this extraordinary leap from roughly 39 years to 60.5 years.
A 21-year jump. I mean, that is a monumental public health victory.
It absolutely is.
Yeah.
But the total fertility rate only dropped from 6.56 children per woman down to 4.56.
In that exact same 60-year window.
Yes.
So wait, why does that happen? Why do people keep having nearly 5 or 6 kids when the survival rate has gone up so much?
Well, we have to look at how these interventions happen. Public health interventions, distributing antimalarial nets, deploying vaccines, establishing clean water systems, those can be imported.
Right. You can just ship them in.
Exactly. You can drop the mortality rate almost overnight with enough capital and logistics. But fertility rates, those are tied to deep-seated cultural norms.
Oh, sure.
They're tied to agricultural labor needs and women's educational access. A family structure that was designed around having 7 children because, 3 were expected to die from cholera.
That family doesn't just change its behavior because the collar is gone.
Right. The cultural norm outlasts the biological reality.
Wow. And when modern medicine suddenly ensures that almost all those children survive, but the cultural norm of having 6 children remains, the population pyramid develops this impossibly wide base.
Yeah, you get an unprecedented bottleneck of dependence that just suffocates the capital markets.
Okay, so we have a system where all domestic capital is swallowed up by basic consumption. The next logical question in analyzing this macro data is, well, what is the actual labor force doing to generate that consumed value?
Right. Where are they working?
Yeah. And looking at the employment sectors here, the answer seems heavily tied to the land.
Very much so. As recently as 2022, agriculture absorbs 50.1% of total employment in these PRE countries.
So half of the entire labor force is farming.
Yes. Now, it was as high as 61.2% in the 1990s, so there's this slight shift. But half the population in agriculture is still a massive structural anchor.
And we should probably be clear about the type of agriculture.
Absolutely. This is not highly mechanized, capital-intensive farming with, GPS-guided tractors and optimized supply chains.
Because they don't have the money for that.
Exactly. Without access to that national savings pool we discussed earlier, farmers cannot secure loans for mechanization. So what we're looking at is predominantly subsistence farming or very, very low-yield manual labor.
Which introduces an incredibly dangerous level of volatility into their GDP. I'm looking at how the report maps out total GDP growth versus per capita GDP growth, and the divergence is just wild.
It really is.
There are years where total GDP is growing at what looks like a really healthy percentage.
Right.
But the per capita growth, like the actual wealth of the individual person, is dragged down to near zero, or it even goes entirely negative.
Yeah, the mechanism there is simple, but it's devastating.
Walk me through it.
Think of it this way. If a country's economy grows by 3%, that is generally considered positive macroeconomic expansion.
Right. Everyone celebrates 3% growth.
But if the population is growing by 3.5% in that exact same year, the total economic pie got larger, sure. But it's being sliced into so many more pieces that the average citizen just got mathematically poorer.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the gains are entirely consumed by the population boom. It's an economic treadmill that just keeps speeding up.
Yeah.
And historically, if you look at how developing nations stepped off that agricultural treadmill, it was by industrializing.
Right. They move excess low-yield rural labor into manufacturing centers.
Right. You build factories.
Manufacturing provides the crucial middle step. It produces exportable goods, it brings foreign wealth into the domestic economy, and it creates a stable, wage-earning middle class.
But the industrial data for these PRE countries, It shows a sector that is deeply marginalized and so erratic.
Erratic is almost an understatement.
Yeah, the report shows manufacturing growth experiencing terrifying crashes. I'm seeing years where the sector plunges by negative 14.2%.
Which is catastrophic.
You cannot build a middle class or plan a national budget when your core industrial base might contract by 14% in a single fiscal year.
You can't. And the absence of a stable manufacturing sector means the traditional ladder out of poverty is just missing entirely. When you look at the historical industrial revolutions of Western nations, or the rapid industrialization of East Asia.
The factories absorbed the massive youth population.
Exactly. But in these PRE countries, millions of working-age youths are aging into a labor market that has no factories to hire them. And the family farm is already saturated with manual labor.
So, if the manufacturing ladder is broken, the alternative path for economic development requires skipping a step.
Right.
You have to basically bypass basic, low-skill manufacturing and aim straight for a service or technology-driven economy.
Which is incredibly difficult.
Because to do that, you need highly advanced human capital. You need an incredibly educated workforce.
And that forces us to look at the education data in the report.
Oh, boy.
Yeah. And the system detailed here operates less like an escalator for human capital and much more like a leaky funnel.
Okay, let's look at the primary school gross intake numbers first, because at first glance, the data actually seems to suggest a massive policy success.
It does. There's a very high initial enrollment rate. Kids are showing up for the first day of primary school. It's around 90% in many of these areas.
Right. The international community, local governments, they've been highly effective at building the physical schools and driving that initial enrollment.
Because the policy focus for decades has just been access to education.
But wait, if the government builds the school and 90% of the kids enroll, why do the completion rates look so dismal? The data shows a severe drop-off.
A massive drop-off.
Only a fraction of those kids graduate primary school, right? Like 60%.
Yeah.
And an even smaller percentage, around 43%, make it through lower secondary school.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to tie the educational data back to the macroeconomic reality we just established.
In farming.
Exactly. Remember that 50.1% of the workforce is in subsistence agriculture? And the capital markets are dry.
Right.
When a family is barely surviving on low-yield farming, a 12-year-old child represents a crucial piece of economic utility.
Oh, man. So the opportunity cost of keeping that child in a classroom simply becomes too high for the family to bear.
Exactly. The family literally needs that child to work in the fields to ensure basic caloric survival. Or they need them to care for younger siblings so both parents can work.
So the school building itself might be free, but the loss of the child's labor is a cost the family cannot afford.
So the student is pulled out. The systemic failure to convert initial enrollment into actual graduation results in this staggering loss of potential human capital.
And the data shows this leaky funnel isn't draining equally either.
No, not at all.
There is a massive gender shadow over these numbers. Male adult literacy is sitting around 71.2%.
Which isn't perfect, but
female literacy is down at 60.7%.
And that gap only accelerates as you move into higher education. If you look at the Gender Parity Index, or GPI, in advanced schooling, it remains below 0.7.
Below 0.7, so meaning for every 10 men in higher education, there are fewer than 7 women. I'm trying to map out the cascading economic effects of that specific gap. Obviously, you're artificially suppressing your own GDP by keeping half your population out of advanced skills training.
Naturally.
But earlier we talked about the stalled demographic transition. Doesn't female education have a direct mechanical link to fertility rates?
Oh, it is arguably the single most powerful lever a nation possesses.
Really?
There is a deeply established correlation across global data. When women are kept in secondary and higher education, they enter the workforce later.
Makes sense.
They gain more agency over their economic and reproductive choices, and the fertility rate drops organically.
So this is an incredibly dark aha moment in the data.
It really is.
We always hear about building schools as the ultimate charity fix.
Hey.
But improving infant mortality with imported medicine while simultaneously failing to keep girls in secondary school, that is the exact recipe for a demographic trap. By pulling girls out of school to work on subsistence farms, these economies are actively locking in the high birth rates that ensure the next generation will also be too poor to stay in school.
It is a brutal, self-reinforcing cycle.
Yeah.
And to break that cycle, a population doesn't just need schools. It requires a baseline of physical health,
Because a sick child cannot study.
and a sick adult cannot operate heavy machinery.
Which brings us to the health data. And this is where it gets incredibly tough because these PRE countries are fighting a brutal two-front war on public health.
They really are.
And it's draining whatever microscopic government budgets they actually manage to scrape together.
So we have to look at how health transitions normally occur in a developing economy.
Okay.
A wealthy nation typically dealt with diseases sequentially.
One at a time.
Right. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, they built infrastructure to defeat communicable diseases. Cholera, tuberculosis, malaria.
So infectious stuff.
Exactly. Once the population was surviving those infectious threats, they lived long enough to develop non-communicable diseases.
Like heart disease, diabetes, cancer.
Right. The healthcare system had decades to pivot its funding and its infrastructure from one type of threat to the other.
But the data for the PRU countries shows they're dealing with both concurrently.
Yes.
I'm looking at the numbers from the report. Over the last few decades, deaths from communicable diseases dropped from 69.6% down to 54.7%.
Which is the imported medicine and sanitation working.
Right. But simultaneously, deaths from non-communicable diseases rose from 23.4% up to 35.2%.
And the financial mechanics of that dual burden are just paralyzing.
I can imagine.
Think about it. Communicable disease control requires massive logistical networks, distributing millions of mosquito nets, maintaining cold chain storage for vaccines, testing water supplies across rural areas.
All about reach.
Exactly. But non-communicable disease control,
Oh.
that requires highly specialized, capital-intensive infrastructure.
Right, like MRI machines, oncology wards, long-term insulin subsidies, and they have to fund both of those systems at the exact same time, using a tax base that is largely composed of informal subsistence agricultural workers.
Which is mathematically impossible for a domestic budget to support.
Imagine trying to fund a 21st century oncology ward while still fighting 19th century cholera outbreaks.
It forces the infrastructure to fracture. You just can't do it.
And we see similar fractures when we look at their environmental and energy data, don't we?
We do.
The report flags a 121% jump in CO2 emissions since 1990.
Which sounds high.
It does. Now, obviously, an industrializing nation is going to emit more carbon, but the underlying metric that really jumped out to me is their energy intensity. It is sitting at 5.9 megajoules per dollar.
Right. So energy intensity measures how much energy a country has to burn to generate a single dollar of GDP.
Okay, so a score of 5.9, I assume that's high.
It is remarkably high.
I
And it points to a deep systemic inefficiency.
want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. Does that essentially mean to generate a single dollar of local wealth, they have to burn significantly more fuel than a developed nation would?
Substantially more.
Wow.
And the reason comes right back to capital. Because these nations lack the national savings and the sovereign credit ratings to build modern, highly efficient, centralized power grids.
Like large-scale renewables or modern nuclear plants?
Exactly. So the population is forced to rely on decentralized, highly polluting, and incredibly inefficient energy sources.
So we're talking about millions of small diesel generators running businesses.
Right.
Or people burning raw biomass just for basic heating and cooking.
Exactly. They are locked into a development model that requires high energy consumption for very, very low economic yield.
That sounds incredibly fragile.
It makes their entire macroeconomic structure hyper-vulnerable to global shocks.
Right. If the global price of imported diesel spikes, their local manufacturing and logistics just grind to a complete halt.
Because their energy efficiency is so poor, they physically cannot absorb the cost increase.
Wow. So let's synthesize where we are in this data stack right now, because it is a lot.
It is.
We have an economy with almost no manufacturing base, a massive youth dependency ratio that just eats all domestic savings.
Right.
A dual health crisis bankrupting the state, an education system losing half its students to subsistence farming, and an energy grid running on expensive, inefficient diesel.
That's the landscape.
So how does a macroeconomic system with those parameters stay afloat at all? Where's the liquidity coming from?
The only way a system with those internal deficits survives is through massive external capital injections.
Okay.
We have to look at the data on official development assistance, or ODA.
And looking at the trajectory of net ODA in the report, it is staggering.
It really is.
In 1960, the capital flowing into these PRE countries was measured in the hundreds of millions.
Right.
But by 2022, that number spiked to $41.9 billion annually.
Billion, with a B.
It makes up a massive structural percentage of their gross national income.
It does, and this capital is flowing primarily from DAKE's donors.
Remind me what DAICI stands for.
The Development Assistance Committee, which essentially represents the world's wealthiest economies.
Okay. And just a quick note for you listening, we're simply unpacking the macro data here. We aren't taking political sides on international development policies. We're just looking at what the money actually does.
Exactly. And we have to be highly analytical about what this $41.9 billion does. It is what funds the anti-malarial nets, the vaccine cold chains, and the basic food security programs.
So it's very targeted.
Yes. And it is highly effective at lowering the mortality rate and keeping the population alive.
So what does this all mean? You're saying the aid money acts almost like a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound.
How do you mean?
Like, it keeps the patient breathing by lowering the mortality rate, but it doesn't build the physical roads needed for the patient to walk out of the hospital and get a job.
That's a very accurate way to look at it. The aid sustains the population boom, but it isn't building the factories.
Because building a functional industrial base requires logistical foundations that aid money alone cannot instantly manifest.
Right. If we look at the Logistics Performance Index, the LPI, in the report, these PRE countries are scoring incredibly low.
And the LPI grades infrastructure quality, customs efficiency, the ability to track and trace shipments.
Yeah, on a scale of 1 to 5.
And these countries are hovering around a 2.2 to 2.4.
Which is...
A 2.2 out of 5 is a failing grade in any logistical textbook.
It absolutely is.
Right.
And the infrastructure barrier becomes even more stark when you look at the power grid data.
Oh, this stat blew my mind.
The electrical transmission losses.
Yes. Transmission losses in these nations are sitting at roughly 22%.
It's unbelievable.
Wait, 22%? So you're telling me if a local power plant generates 100 megawatts of electricity, 22 of those megawatts just vanish before they even reach a factory or a home?
Yes, they're just gone.
How does that even happen?
Well, the mechanics of that loss are twofold. First, you have technical losses.
Like bad wiring.
Essentially, yes. Resistance heating in undersized, antiquated cables that are stretching over really long distances.
Okay.
And then you have non-technical losses.
What's a non-technical loss?
That is a polite economic term for unmetered illegal connections. People siphoning power off the grid because the population simply cannot afford the official utility rates.
Wow. Okay, so put yourself in the shoes of a global manufacturer who's assessing where to allocate capital.
Right, you're looking to build.
Say you want to build a massive textile factory to utilize this giant growing labor force. You need reliable power to run the looms, and you need reliable roads and ports to export the garments.
And looking at this data, the risk profile is impossible.
Right. If I lose 22% of my power to grid failure, my overhead costs go through the roof.
You'd have to buy massive diesel backup generators.
Which we already established are wildly inefficient and expensive.
Exactly.
And on top of that, if the national logistics score is a 2.2, my finished garments are going to sit on a dock rotting or get trapped in some inefficient customs bureaucracy for weeks.
Yeah, and capital always flows down the path of least resistance.
Right. I'm going to take my factory and the thousands of jobs it creates to a country with a 4.0 logistics score and a stable grid.
And that data point perfectly explains those 14% contractions in the manufacturing sector we discussed earlier.
It all connects.
Global capital cannot profitably anchor in that environment. And without foreign direct investment building factories, the internal wealth cannot be generated.
The youth have no jobs to age into.
Right. And the nation remains structurally dependent on that $41.9 billion ODA lifeline just to prevent a massive humanitarian collapse.
It is a perfectly interlocking mechanism of stagnation.
It really is.
The foreign aid reduces mortality, which increases the youth population, but the failing infrastructure and that leaky education funnel ensure no jobs are actually created for that surviving population.
The demographic pressure builds, but the economic valve is welded shut.
Man, that is grim.
I know. However, the data does not present this as a terminal condition.
Okay, good. There is a way out.
There is.
Yeah.
Being in the pre-demographic dividend phase is actually a period of immense gathered potential.
Like a coiled spring.
Yes. The population pressure is extraordinary. But if a nation can fundamentally alter its structural inputs, it can release that pressure forward into rapid economic expansion.
So, to unlock what economists call the dividend window, the report's data points toward 3 massive necessary structural shifts. Let's synthesize those for everyone.
Okay. Number 1 is demographic.
Correct. The baseline fertility rates must drop.
That is the absolute prerequisite for capital accumulation.
Because you can't save money if you're feeding 6 kids.
Exactly. Until the fertility rate drops, the youth dependency ratio will remain at 90%, and every dollar generated will be consumed by basic survival. The working age population must be given the demographic breathing room to start saving money.
Which leads directly into the second pillar, education. But not just, building more schools.
No, the policy focus has to ruthlessly shift from initial enrollment to graduation rates.
The funnel has to be plugged.
Right, and the data makes it incredibly clear that prioritizing female retention in secondary education is the primary mechanism here.
Because it hits both targets.
Yes. It achieves both a skilled workforce and a organically lower fertility rate. It is the single highest leverage intervention available to these nations.
Wow. And the third pillar is industry and infrastructure. You simply cannot rely on agricultural subsistence forever.
You have to overhaul the basic physical grid.
Right. The logistics networks, the electrical grids, they have to be stabilized to lower the risk profile for global capital.
If you can reduce those transmission losses and improve customs efficiency, manufacturing will take root.
And a stable manufacturing sector is what will finally absorb that massive youth population and actually convert their labor into taxable national wealth.
Exactly. If a nation can align those three pillars, lower fertility, female educational retention, and stabilized physical infrastructure, they can convert this massive demographic burden into human capital.
We would literally be looking at the world's next great economic miracles.
Without a doubt.
1 billion young, increasingly educated, capable people finally entering the global market.
And it's not unprecedented. It is the exact blueprint that transformed multiple East Asian economies over the late 20th century. The transition from a demographic trap to a demographic dividend is entirely possible.
But as we close out this deep dive, there is an incredibly stark implication hiding in the margins of this report.
There always is.
The data models the mechanics of the trap, and it outlines the path to the dividend, but it forces you to think about the alternative timeline.
What happens if the structural shifts fail?
Right. What happens if these PRE countries don't manage to open this economic window? Because the demographics are already locked in. The billion people are already here.
Yeah, they aren't going anywhere.
We are looking at a fast-approaching future where these regions will be home to over 1 billion working-age youths. 1 billion people living under failing power grids with vast literacy gaps and absolutely no domestic industrial jobs to hire them.
And human populations do not simply sit quietly in a state of permanent economic deprivation.
Exactly. If that immense demographic energy is not absorbed by local economic growth, it will become kinetic.
That is the real danger.
Will this pressure lead to the most massive wave of global migration the modern world has ever seen? Because people will inevitably move to where the capital is, to where the jobs are, and to where the grids actually function.
They have to survive.
The failure or success of the demographic dividend in these specific countries isn't just a localized economic issue. It is a mechanism that is going to fundamentally reshape the geopolitical and economic map for every nation on Earth.
And the timeline for that transition is actively running out.
It changes how you look at a simple population graph, doesn't it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the numbers. We'll see you next time.